In this video, I want to go through an example of process costing. It will help if you have already viewed the brief introductory video I did on process costing before you watch this video. The data I want to use for this example is here. We're going to assume that we have 1,000 units sitting in beginning work in process. These units are 100% complete as it relates to materials and 60% complete as it relates to conversion costs. We then started during this current accounting period an additional 35,000 units, which means we have a total of 36,000 units that we need to account for. And by account for, I mean that we need to determine the costs associated with them. At the end of the accounting period, we have 5,000 units in work in process. Those units are 100% complete as it relates to materials and 20% complete as it relates to conversion costs. So what we're doing with process costing, again, is trying to allocate our costs to the various units. For process costing, we effectively have a three-step process. The first step is to compute the number of equivalent units we have based on the production that has been done. And keep in mind, I defined equivalent units in that introductory video. So in this column, we have physical units, and then in columns D and E, we'll be computing equivalent units for direct materials and for conversion costs. Note that they potentially will be different because our percentage completion is different based on whether are talking direct materials or conversion costs. So first thing we know is that we completed and transferred out during the current period 31,000 units. How do I know that? Well, I walked through this calculation. I took our 1,000 units in beginning WIP and added to that the number of units that we started, the 35,000. Then that gave us the 36,000 units. One of two things happened to those units. Either we finished them and moved them out, or we didn't, in which case they're still sitting in ending work in process. Well, I know that we have 5,000 sitting in ending work in process, which means the difference must be what we completed and transferred out. Now, bear in mind that we're oversimplifying this and we are ignoring the concept of spoilage or damaged units. But that says we took 31,000, completed, transferred them out. Then we have our 5,000 units from ending inventory, and that leaves us with the 36,000 units that we accounted for. Now, this number of accounted for and this number to account for need to equal. So we need to make sure that we have accounted for all the units in computing our equivalent units. Okay, so equivalent units. Now, if these 31,000 units are completed, then they are effectively 100% finished, which means for both direct materials and conversion costs, the physical units and the equivalent units will be exactly the same. This is only because we know they're 100% complete. For the ending work in process, we need to know what the percentage completion is. And I gave us this information right here, 100% as it relates to materials, 20% as it relates to conversion costs. So direct materials, for equivalent units will be equal to $5,000. We have added all of the direct materials that we intend to. Conversion costs, on the other hand, are going to be prorated. If we have 5,000 physical units that are 20% complete, that is the same as having 100% complete 1,000 units. And I got that just by multiplying the 5,000 times the 20% completion. Then if we add these columns up, our equivalent units for direct materials is 36,000. Our equivalent units for conversion costs is 32,000. Step 1 is completed. Step 2 is to compute our cost per equivalent unit. Keep in mind, our ultimate goal is to assign costs to our units. Therefore, we need to have a cost per unit in order to do that. Now, what we need to know then is what were our costs. Beginning inventory, we have $7,550 in costs. This is data that I'm giving you. Of that, $2,350 is direct materials and $5,200 is conversion. Then, during the period, we incurred an additional $146,050, of which direct materials is $84,050, conversion costs is $62,000. This gives us a grand total of $153,600 that we have to account for. That's broken down into $86,400 in direct materials and $67,200 in conversion costs. So now we can compute the cost per equivalent unit. And again, we're going to have two different costs per equivalent unit because there are different equivalent units for direct materials than there are for conversion costs. So for direct materials, we will pull the equivalent units of 36,000 down, and then we will divide the 86,400 by the 36,000 equivalent units, and that gives us $2.40 per equivalent unit for materials. Then we'll do the same thing for conversion costs. We'll pull down the 32,000, and then we will divide the 67,200 by the 32,000 to come up with $2.10 per unit for conversion costs. If we add those together, that gives us a grand total of $4.50 per equivalent unit. But we need to be careful as to how we use that $4.50. And I'll explain that further in a moment. Okay, so the last step is to assign our costs and then do a cost reconciliation. And by that, I mean we want to make sure that once we've assigned costs, that the amount of costs that have been assigned is equal to the $153,600 in costs that we need to account for. So here's what we can do. Completed and transferred out, we had 31,000 units. And if you go back up to our schedule, that was the same for direct materials and for conversion costs. Again, because they were 100% complete. So here is where we can use the $4.50. We can take the 31,000 equivalent units, multiply it by the $4.50, and that gives us a total of $139,500 in completed and transferred out costs. Work in process is a little trickier because remember, the work in process units were not at the same level of completion for direct materials as they were for conversion costs. So we had equivalent units 5,000 for direct materials and only 1,000 for conversion costs. So now what we'll have to do is use the individual costs per equivalent units. So we will assign to work in process a total of 5,000 equivalent units times the $2.40 or $12,000. Then for conversion costs, we will take the 1,000 units, multiply it by the $2.10 per equivalent unit, and that gives us 2,100, which if you add those together, I did not do that, but let's do that. If you add those together, you've got a total of $14,100 in ending work in process. Now, that's the assignment of the costs. Here's the reconciliation. If we add the 139.5 plus the 12 plus the 2,100, that gives us 153,600, which is equal to our total costs and tells us that we have assigned all the costs that we needed to. Now, let's look at some journal entries. I think I had mentioned in the original introductory video that for the most part, your journal entries and the accounts, the flow of costs is the same whether you're using the job costing or process costing allocation. However, there is one difference because remember, under process costing, we accumulate costs by department. Now, if this particular department that we're working in was the initial department, and in fact, just because those 31,000 units were completed and transferred out, they're not finished. They're not being transferred into finished goods. They're being transferred into the department that does the next process. Then our journal entry to transfer them out would actually be a debit to another work in process account for that second department. We'll call it Department B, and a credit to work in process Department A. So one difference here is that under process costing, you will have however many WIP accounts you have departments for. Now, if this were indeed the final department, in other words, those 31,000 units were finished and ready to sell, then we would indeed debit finished goods and credit work in process Department A. Now, one last comment before we leave this example. What do we do with the work in process, that 14,100? We don't actually have to do anything with it because it will fall out naturally. Let's look at a T account for work in process. You can see the debit to work in process for the beginning balance. This was carried forward from the previous accounting period. You can see the debit for the additional costs incurred, and then the credit for the 139,500 that we transferred out, whether we transferred it into another department or to finished goods. It doesn't matter, we transferred it out of here. If you determine the balance left in WIP after those journal entries are posted, that's your 14,100. That's the ending balance, and that's what you want to see equal to what you allocated to work in process.